sector. He has run several large transformation programs in big pharma companies, among them worked on various aspects of the Pfizer-Wyeth integration in commercial and development, as well as on the Pfizer-Hospira integration. He has also worked on the Novartis-GSK asset swap on the oncology integration. But we also have with us today 4 very experienced panelists with whom we will discuss this conceptual idea after Ben's presentation. Mr. Joe Sawyer has more than 20 years of experience in both pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies in Europe and the US. He joined Novartis in Switzerland 13 years ago and initially led clinical trial activities for CVM compounds, including Diovan, Galvus, and Trestro, and also the recently announced trial Cantos. Other positions within Novartis have seen him lead the global operational management for the general medicines portfolio and the R&D partnerships across all divisions of Novartis. Mr. Sawyer currently leads the external partnerships for 4 major CROs and has full accountability for the oncology, biosimilars, all phase 1 and GMA outsource activities, promoting the science of operations, and he also teaches postgraduates at Basel University. We also have in the panel Dr. Birgitte Volk, who is a Senior Vice President, Head of R&D Rare Disease at GlaxoSmithKline in the UK. Before joining GSK, Dr. Volk was Chief Medical Officer and Senior Vice President of Development at Swedish Orphan Biovitrum AB. She has also had several senior positions with Amgen, Genzyme, and Pharmexa, and in the late 90s, Dr. Volk had various clinical and scientific assignments at the Copenhagen University. Dr. Volk also serves on the board of directors in several companies, among them Wilson Therapeutics and the CRO TFS Triform Support. Mr. Jacob Gunterberg, next to Joe Sawyer, serves as a partner and venture partner at HealthCap and is one of the largest specialized providers in venture capital within life sciences in Europe. Before joining HealthCap, Mr. Gunterberg was co-founder of the corporate finance firm Hjalmarsson and Gunterberg in 2000, after having been a director and responsible for the life sciences sector within the corporate finance department of Aro Securities. He has gained extensive experience from origination and execution of transactions, particularly in the life sciences sector. Mr. Gunterberg serves on the board of directors of several life sciences companies, among them Revent Medical. We also have Mr. Ole Pirou, who is the managing director of DNB's investment banking division in Sweden. He has more than 20 years of experience in corporate finance with a background from Macquarie, Alfred Berg, ABN AMRO, and Swedbank. And he has extensive experience from public and private M&A as well as ECM transactions, many of them being within life science sector. In recent years, Mr. Pirou has also been involved in several biotech IPOs, among them Wilson Therapeutics, Alligator Bioscience, and Oncopeptides. I think you understand that we have a very prominent panel with us today with lots of experience to discuss this topic. So please give me, together with me, them a warm hand. Ben, may I ask you to please take the stage and describe to us what this concept is all about?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Ulrika, for that introduction. It's very nice to be here in the Nordics. I almost feel like an honorary member of the Nordic countries. I'm Dutch, but I've lived in the United States for many years, and the amount of times I've had to tell them that Amsterdam is not in Denmark and that Copenhagen is not the capital of the Netherlands makes me feel a bit closer to home today. Today I will be talking about a way to realize value from more clinical trials. And let's start with some quick facts. There are 254,000 active clinical trials in the world at this moment. 44,000 of those are actually recruiting, and more than 17,000 of those are in the Nordics. In major biopharma companies, up to 20% of planned trials move down the priority list. This happens for many different reasons, obviously. And at least 30% of trial timelines slip between final protocol and first patient, first visit. And the last one, in 2015, $9.6 billion of venture funding went to pharma, and that number is going up. So I want to talk to you about drug development and clinical trials, and how in these times of optimization and maximizing shareholder value, a lot of value in drug development is actually left on the table. One loser is the shareholder of the pharma company, another is the patient who does not get access to as many innovative medicines as they maybe could. Today I will propose a different approach that will allow multiple companies to work together to get a return and also make more medicines available. To get straight to the point, view this image. What do you see? Not a drug. This is a rope. Pretty commonplace item, and you could probably imagine using it in many different situations. Adventurous, practical, recreational, and many more. Next one, probably one you didn't think of. If the rope breaks, everybody has a good time. Here you have a whole lot of ropes. If one of them is missing, or we add an extra one, nobody will notice. Two mega stores, well known all over the world. They sell ropes, among many other things. And do you think they would really notice if anything changed in their rope inventory or rope performance? And last, someone for who it is critically important that she actually has a rope, that it's strong enough and that it's long enough. Making the point, value is relative, although I think most of you will probably know that. How, you might ask, does this apply to drug development and clinical trials? Allow me to tell you a story. It's not new, and some of you will know it because the author Barry Worth wrote it down very eloquently in his books Billion Dollar Molecule and The Antidote. The books describe the story of Vertex when it was a fledgling pharmaceutical company with assets in its pipeline but no drugs on the market. It had a promising drug for cystic fibrosis but not enough funding for its phase 3 trials. And both internally and externally, executives and investors were very skeptical. In came the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation on behalf of a very large patient population for whom no good treatments were available. With their financial and operational support, Vertex successfully ran their phase 3 trial and followed that with the launch of Kalydeco. Kalydeco is projected to generate $1.8 billion in revenue next year, and the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation cashed in on its royalties for $3.3 billion, making it probably the richest patient organization in the world. Another story is that of the company Roivant, or ROI-Vant, which has made a nice living out of acquiring pharmaceutical assets from the scrap heaps of other pharma companies and successfully developing them, although on some of those acquisitions the jury is still out. They base their investment decisions on data, which is really the currency of clinical trials. So what is the actual problem we're trying to solve? First, look at the potential movement of the value of a pharmaceutical asset. When a company actively develops an asset through clinical trials, the value of its asset increases if the trials meet their endpoints. Of course, there are other factors such as activity by competitors and other market events, and the line is not necessarily gradual either. The red line here indicates the patent expiration date, which is a major factor in decision making. What happens after a trial will depend on many aspects and what else is needed and required. Clearly, the same activity can also lead to a decline in value. If a trial does not meet its endpoints, the value will likely decline. There are exceptions, of course, as completely different findings may lead to an increased value, but that's not the point here. A failed trial does not necessarily mean that the value goes to zero, because data will be generated, which will help drive decision-making for development assets in the same indication, greater insights in a backup compound development, or inform areas such as toxicity or technical elements for other drugs. Lastly, the company does nothing, which is what we're looking at today. The company delays some of its planned clinical trials. The patent expiration date does not move. Therefore, the potential value the company can earn from the asset declines. And to execute the trial or trials as time progresses, making it a less likely candidate for future development. In general, trials can move the value of assets up or down, and if a trial affects a phase transition, it will actually realize a major value increase. Companies allocate their resources to maximize the return of development dollars. Nothing new there. The logical result is that the execution of some clinical trials will be accelerated and others will be delayed or even cancelled, which effectively erodes the value created to that point. This value erosion comes in multiple forms. A reduction in asset value for the pharma company is one example, and a potential promising drug not going to the patient is another. So why do those trials not progress? Because biopharma companies have more assets requiring clinical trials in their portfolio than they have resources to run all those trials. In this example, they would need to spend about $1.2 billion in a year to run all the trials they have planned for. And they have less than that to spend. Let's say they have 700 million to spend on in-house trials, and that will obviously focus on the trials that are most important to them. And if they have the funding, another 300 million will be outsourced. So that brings us to $1 billion and leaves 200 million on the table. And those trials will be lower priority and those will be delayed. The potential reduces the value of the assets that these trials link to. This leads to the question, how can we limit this erosion of value, generate a return for participants, and make more new treatment options available? What we propose is a twofold solution. The first step of that is disconnecting the trial from the asset and commoditize its data, which becomes the actual value. And a disconnected trial will also have some advantages in the actual transaction that we're looking at later, because it's a different matter to move a trial than to move a full asset. And the second step is we use a partnership approach. In that partnership approach, we'll look at 3 distinct types of participants. I will take you through the relevant aspects in this approach for each type, and after that we'll go into a bit more detail. So first there's biopharma. Biopharmaceutical companies have the portfolio of clinical trials and not enough funding or expertise potentially to run them. What they bring to the partnership is the planned trial, including the protocol, the data related to prior trials, and the API. Then we have investors, including the traditional investor, banks, venture capital firms, private equity, but also organizations such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation I mentioned before, that have a specific mission and the funds and operational capability to realize it. Both types of investors will look to generate a return, even though that return might be different for each. Again, value is relative. And then last, the CROs, they will be doing the actual trial work, which is their core expertise, though some of them are also active on the investment side. The mechanism for this is as follows. First, there's some homework, because we need to identify and analyze the trials, find the appropriate partners, and develop the operating model. Of course, all parties will need to do due diligence, not just on the asset in question or the trial in question, but also on each other. And part of the homework will also be to think about the exit strategy early on. We create an investment vehicle, we'll call it TrialCo, designed and managed by an independent party and tailor-made for the trials, partners, financial circumstances that are in place. The biopharma company transfers its planned trial into TrialCo as IP. This includes data, knowledge, and also risk, and the risk element is essential. Only when there is a real transfer of risk will the pharma company not have to put the development costs onto their P&L. And let me elaborate on that a little bit. If a trial has a 95 to 98% success rate, and the pharma company thinks, oh, we'll put this in an investment partnership, and then we take it back and we don't have to show the costs, the The outside world will look at that, well, that's just off-balance sheet financing, and that won't really mean anything. So there has to be a serious risk factor, and the investor will actually need to have a chance to lose its money or its investment. The investor, they will transfer funds into TrialCo, which is money at risk, and then TrialCo will contract with the CRO to execute the relevant clinical trials. And that looks very transactional. It is not. All three parties, or more potentially, will need to be involved throughout the process because their information, their requirements all need to be considered throughout the design. So not as transactional as that might have suggested. Then we execute, which includes a lot of communication. Governance will be very important, and of course the CRO delivering the actual trial. The value of the trial is realized once the CSR is finalized and after the trial has been concluded. And then in terms of exit, that can be dealt with on a by-trial basis or on the TrialCo basis, depending on a portfolio. A bit more detail on the how and why for each of those players. It starts with the pharmaceutical companies, and this includes biotech firms and pre-commercial companies, because they have the assets, clinical development plans and knowledge of data required to inform the clinical trials. Especially phase 2 and 3 trials are very expensive and therefore potentially attractive for the larger investors. There's at least one US investor that funds clinical trials, taking on all the risk on success and failure in exchange for future milestone payments. So that's not even a vehicle, it's straightforward. I pay for your trial and you pay me back in the future if you make money of it. Portfolio management in pharma companies is a very dynamic process, and trials fall in and out of favor and change priority on a regular basis, driven by other trial outcomes and market forces, and probably other elements. Clearly, pharmaceutical companies are not ignoring this either, and joint development, licensing deals, buying and selling assets are all tools they use to get the most out of their portfolio. That said, there are still trials that are delayed, often repeatedly, and with every year of delay, the present value declines to the point that it hits zero because the patent expiration date is too close. Why would this be of interest to a pharma company? In short, it will get to develop more of its drug pipeline for no extra charge to its P&L. These assets would otherwise just decline in value. If the trial is successful, the pharma company has the option to either spend the money to buy the data back from TrialCo at very low risk, or to share future revenue with the investors, or a combination thereof. On the investor side, earlier I mentioned two types of investors, the traditional investor like banks and the non-traditional investor such as a patient organization. These two types have different objectives and different operating models, but otherwise they will consider investing in one or more clinical trials on the same merits. What are the risks? What is the likelihood of success? And what and when is the expected return? Investors are interested in investments where they understand what they are investing in, understand the risk profile, and believe they have a good probability to generate a high return relative to that risk. That means investing in clinical trials is not for every investor because it requires an understanding of the industry, of the very long drug development process. I mean, even a clinical trial can take multiple years to complete, let alone bringing a drug to market. Understanding the market and the regulations and multiple other areas. However, for investors who understand life sciences, this is an attractive idea. The risk for each trial is generally well understood, and by packaging multiple clinical trials with different assets, the overall investment can be managed as a portfolio with a different and probably more attractive risk profile than just one trial or one asset. Another important aspect for investors is the exit process. There are many different ways partners can agree how to exit and when, and the operative word here is agreeing upfront. The exit strategy can be linked to future payments, or the pharma company can buy the trial outcomes back from TrialCo, after which the investor can cash out. There are many options in between these scenarios. In addition to funds, investors bring expertise in structuring transactions like this, and they understand how to manage, monitor, and mitigate risks. Third party, CROs. When I talk about the investors, I brought up the packaging of multiple trials. This is also attractive for CROs, making it possible for them to create efficiencies and leverage their particular strengths. While CROs are mentioned last here, their role in making this model successful is very important, and their input is necessary early in the process to understand costs and timing of the operation. The CRO is the partner responsible for executing the actual trial and maximizing the chances for a successful outcome. They bring operational expertise and capacity as well as science. What makes this model attractive for the CRO is straightforward. They will have the freedom to operate under their own QMS and site selection. They create a long-term predictable revenue stream with minimal business development efforts. They develop or improve their partnership with biopharma companies. And then some CROs have suggested they would like to get their own investment arms involved, sharing in the risk and the potential reward of the venture. There's a few examples of trials in the portfolio of big pharmaceutical companies, and this is all public information, that have been stalled for some time. And they're of mixed relevance, but as an illustration, it probably is useful. So if we look at Sanofi, dupilumab at first glance looks quite attractive. Immunoinflammation is a good area. Vaccine, on the other hand, this trial has been in the same phase for about 3 years. But vaccines are highly complex and also very competitive. So it might not be a good trial for this particular model. Looking at Takeda, the namilumab in immunology looks quite attractive. There's an accessible and well understood patient population. There's a track record in biologics, and the execution is predictable. Sapanisertib, the oncology compound, probably less so. The market and technology for oncology is developing very fast, and we would be at risk to be 1 or 2 generations behind by the time we finish. And then Novartis, they have a number of trials of interest that are currently delayed. Amilomitide for Alzheimer's disease, attractive at the surface, but also representing a high risk. So not straightforward. And then the second one, also in oncology, with the potential for second and third line treatment. However, the same applies here, as I mentioned, with the Takeda drug. It's risky. So where does that leave us? To wrap this up, so the premise of this is pretty straightforward. The design and the successful execution are not trivial and will take time and effort and be unique for every situation. There are many variables, and TrialCo could take a number of different forms in terms of partners, products, return, duration, and risk profile, and also in terms of legal structure. It can be tailored to the drug and the requirements of the participants. That said, when designed and implemented well, it delivers for all 3 groups of participants. More drugs developed for patients at minimal cost for the pharma company. A new avenue for return on investment for the investors, and then expanding portfolio for the CRO. I will now give the microphone back to Ulrika, who will drill down into the subject with a lot of penetrating questions for the various panel members. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. Yes, there are lots of questions on this conceptual idea, and again, we have a prominent panel here that will help us elucidate some of these questions. So, Joe, maybe I'll start with you. You have been a co-architect, if we call it that, for the development of this conceptual idea. From your perspective, what would you say is the biggest beauty with this idea?
Quite simply, I think that everybody stands to gain something in a realistic time, in a realistic manner. What the value is really is depending on which part of the organization or which part of the triangle you're really looking at. But in reality, all 3 players, be it the biopharma or even I would say academia, if you have a compound, the CRO and the financial wing of the whole process are participating in a piece of clinical research which otherwise would not be taking place in that time frame. And that alone, must have some sort of benefit for the end result, which is a new therapy for patients. And that's really why certainly all the pharma companies are really working on this. So it is a win, and hopefully another win. So it's 3 wins.
Oh, that's good. Win-win-win is always good. But why then hasn't it been tried before, if it is such a win-win-win?
Great question. In reality, when we look at a biopharma, we are an aggressive organization in most cases. When you don't have the capacity or capability to perform a trial, simply you can go to a CRO and purchase it. Obviously, purchasing takes finance. When you don't have the finance part, you're kind of stuck as a biopharma. No funding, no trial. The default mechanism for most biopharma tends to be either partnering, co-partnering with another pharma, which in itself brings incredible headaches, stresses, and strains for all involved, or you look to a traditional mechanism of out-licensing. But again, that takes a significant amount of time, energy, and quite frankly, if you do not have, as a biopharma, enough data to convince yourself that this is really worthwhile, downplaying another part of your portfolio for this, then you're going to find it incredibly difficult to convince external organizations that your data really is worth taking a punt on. And despite the fact that all pharma, we plan for months and months, years in advance, the unexpected happens. My organization, Novartis, about a month ago, we released the CANTOS trial, the canakinumab, in cardiovascular. We expected we would have to fund another cardiovascular trial. That's predictable. What we were totally blown away by is the fact all of a sudden you have a benefit in lung cancer. So therefore that needs investment. When something is so good and falls out of the tree unexpectedly, you have a finite amount of resource and capacity, something has to give. And it's the trials at the bottom which give, but we typically focus our mechanism for resolution at a asset level, at a compound level. That's probably the reason why.
So, given what is happening now, not just now, but there have been quite some successes recently also in breakthrough therapies, do you think there will be more trials that will be down prioritized that sort of generates a boost for the concepts like this?
I think down prioritize is probably the wrong way of looking at it. Down prioritization, we have internal proponents of all of our assets. That's how we get that way. We have a great R&D, co-development mechanism. We don't like to down prioritize our babies, but we have to face the real fact that we can't take them any further in the time frame, and the clock is always ticking. And when that clock is ticking, it becomes harder and harder to pick up the baton again and start development when opportunity arises.
Birgitte, you're presenting another organization. Do you share the same view on this?
Yeah, I think, there's always a portfolio management decision, and the larger company, often the more assets you have to decide again. And it also, I think, relates to the strategic direction of the company. So, there are changes happening at times, and that might, have some fallbacks for certain, potentially valuable assets that can provide value, for patients and for society and for shareholders as well, but just can't be prioritized in the investment priorities that any company needs to make. So I think, it's a drug development becomes increasingly difficult, and there are many aspects to consider when making the priorities on which assets or which portfolios or which areas. Many companies are required to make more focus and more diversity, whereas the smaller companies many times can prioritize small opportunities where there also are repurposing of assets that just can't be financed for various reasons. So yeah, at large, I think it's along those lines. even though I do have some other perspectives as well also, but I'll come back to that.
Yeah, well, and with the increase in complexity then in drug development, there will be need for new models of financing, and this is one idea of that, so it fits quite well, the purpose. Yeah, good. But getting back to you, Joe, what would you say that it is equally attractive for all parties to participate in this proposed partnership? Or is it really the biopharma company that owns the assets that is the true winner?
For me, again referring to an earlier answer, I generally believe it's a society as a whole. It's the patients who are benefiting. If you can get a new molecular entity into a product onto the market, it benefits the patients. The CROs, you're getting access to a portfolio of trials which was never actually ever considered for outsourcing because you didn't have the financial gain. Therefore, they can have a predictable, I would say, workflow with minimal business development. You don't have to go looking for the trials. The trials are falling into this trial co-model, which allows you to actually just contribute. For the financial organization, you are getting a potential to contribute funding and return of investment to a broader portfolio of assets, each with different varying risks, each with a different length or life of investment, whether a trial's 2 years, 5 years, 7 years for a mega trial. So you have a range of flexibility in your investing strategies. For the biopharma, of course, yes, you are developing an asset to a potential next milestone, but that milestone can then lead to other discoveries. If the trial fails, you're actually still generating clinical trial data, which could be used for your backup molecules or to give you an insight into a totally different disease burden. So for me, everybody is gaining something, but what you gain and the time frame you gain it is variable.
Jakob, you present a well-known VC firm investing globally in life sciences. What was your first reaction when you learned about this conceptual idea?
Well, I think, it has some similarities with other off-balance sheet models, of course, and spin-outs with buyback rights, but it seems more contained, more manageable, perhaps, from a risk perspective. So I think that's on the positive side. Of course, depending on how you agree on the exact trial design to be, executed and so forth. I guess you can have many different views on clinical trial designs, but that's perhaps too detailed.
Probably, yes.
Yeah.
But from a VC's perspective, what would be the primary attraction to enter into this suggested partnership model?
Well, I think one would assume that the molecule or the program in question has been documented really well, and this would, I would think, mostly apply for later stage clinical trials in phase 2, 2Bs, phase 3s, or in those later stages. And then that would mean that your molecule would most likely have been, developed according to the biopharma, big pharma school book, development standards, so to speak. And that's probably a benefit. Many smaller companies, they need to prioritize and cannot do everything in characterizing the molecule or similar.
So under which circumstances then would you prefer to engage in this partnership instead of investing in a standalone company with an asset of similar profile or potential?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it depends on the probability of success, the terms you're getting, how you feel about, the indication, of course, which has to do with the probability of success and the competition in that field, so forth.
But if you compare an asset with, similar probability of success, similar unmet medical need, similar commercial potential.
I think there's one big difference here. If we look at Trial Co as a vehicle for many different clinical trials in one company and compare that with a smaller company, single program or perhaps 2-program company, you don't really know what you understand in the what you invest in the beginning until you have compiled your portfolio. In the small company, I think you know what you're setting out to do and to accomplish, and you have more control. Of course, we talked about this before. You have the competitive aspect to the exit, which you don't have in this pre-negotiated structure.
Okay, good.
And perhaps you have more freedom to wiggle as you go in your standalone company.
So I guess it is similar then with if you compare this concept to a traditional spin-out deal from pharma, what are the pros and cons with those two different models?
I think the flexibility may be larger in a traditional spin-out, of course. You may have more room to do it your way, and perhaps more cost-effective, I don't know. And I guess you have more room for staffing it the way you want to staff it. I think this model more alludes to a sort of partnership with three parties, and the CRO is really important in the management of this trial as I understand it. So probably less flexibility, but perhaps more contained in this in your suggested model here.
Good. Birgitta, you have a long career in clinical development in various biopharma companies and also working as a doctor in clinical practice. What would you see as the primary advantage from an overall life science industry perspective of this concept, if any?
So first of all, I think our life sciences sector, including the external market dynamics, the societies, the governments, etc., I mean, is changing massively, and we are all facing a new reality in the context of commercialization and realizing the return of the investment of the asset. So I really accomplish and acknowledge new initiatives for new business models, because that definitely is required. So my congratulations for such a great initiative. So that said, I think it does hold the potential to really unlock some of the value that those like stagnating or unprogressed clinical studies they hold in terms of providing value for patients and for society. I can just say from my industry career, I can witness numerous programs that I have been very passionate about progressing. But as I said before, in the context of a company's requirement to make portfolio investments and the right decisions on behalf of owners or shareholders, and also for patients, I think you need to make your investments where there is the highest probability for reaching access to patient first and return of investment being the largest, etc. Doesn't mean that the lower return of investment opportunities doesn't hold less value for patients and for society. So I think that's what I really am excited about. I mean, exploring new paths where you can realize that potential.
So bringing in a lot of different values, just as we saw in the initial parts of Ben's presentation. Do you see any complications?
No. Yeah, I see loads of potential obstacles, but as I say, I compliment and welcome new business models, new initiatives, because it's needed. So first of all, I think there's more than the trial execution as such to realizing the potential of a molecule, and the field I work in rare diseases is a field that's very dominated by advanced therapeutic medicinal products, very complex new treatment modalities that requires a very niche specific know-how in terms of CMC, process development, manufacturing as such. So therefore, sometimes those aspects actually might be the bottleneck to allow adequate resources for certain studies to be progressed in a portfolio. So that is something that's not necessarily encountered in this model, but of course, I mean, you don't need to take the HMPs first. You can take more traditional small molecules or therapeutic, biologics, etc. So that's just one aspect. That's more to it than trial execution itself. The other part is that as I say, our world is changing when it comes to drug development and commercialization, and it becomes much more horizontally integrated, meaning that when you have a research discovery idea, a molecule, you progress it into first time in human or in phase 2A to B, where some of these aspects could be considered. But then, when you want to take on a stagnated program that might be the same molecule just for different indications, or it might be a molecule that rests on itself for that single indication. I mean, if it is for multiple indication with the same asset, there is indication sequencing that does have an impact on price and reimbursement and access. So therefore, again, you can't treat necessarily like a program just for the trial execution and realizing that independently of another portfolio of a company. So there are some interdependencies there that needs to be taken into account, depending again what asset it is. But given that we work in an increasingly challenging reimbursement and access environment, that's components that needs to be factored into the drug development and clinical trial evidence generation efforts, and therefore just gives another level of complexity in that new TRICO formation as I see it. And thirdly, again, our industry is increasingly dominated by partnership. Big pharma partnering with small biotech, pharma alliances in between big pharma or smaller pharmas. And the alliance management in itself is not trivial. I mean, even within a two-party component. So bringing in 3 parties, I think that there is definitely the governance structure that will inform how you can progress an asset, again, with the right decisions at the right time. There needs to be an accountable one who's going to make the decisions at certain inflection points during the progression of a program. So these are just some examples that I can see, I mean, needs to be addressed. But again, I don't see, I mean, obstacles as such. I just point to them as aspects that needs to be addressed. And again, being assigned to a specific program, a specific asset in a specific opportunity.
So some challenges expected. Joe and Ben, I guess when you were tweaking around with this, the governance part of it was also on your agenda. I mean, just as you say, alliance management is tricky, and here we're bringing in 3 or more parties into it. So,
Actually, I'll take that one to a degree. Absolutely, the governance and oversight of this is fully critical. We work in a regulated environment, so whoever's running the trial, the sponsor will be the biopharma or the academia. They still need to demonstrate that they have strong oversight of the trial activity. Otherwise, when it comes to dossier submission, you're going to be in deep trouble. For the actual model itself, I would definitely see that you would have to have an executive steering committee of all 3 parties, of where the 2 driving parties, I am afraid, would have to be in my view, the pharma company and the investment arm. The CRO, yes, you will have to have a seat at the table, but it wouldn't necessarily be the core driving part, because at the end of the day, it is the pharma company in concert with the finance arm who will be deciding what the protocol design is and how that needs to be operationalized. To a degree, once that decision is made, then the CRO would play a larger role in what you would call a lower level operational steering committee. And there, the CRO will be really contributing its value and knowledge in terms of how to actually conduct the trial and what are the risks in conducting the trial with regards to timelines, patient site access, etc., etc. So, and then at the final level, it really would again be led by probably the pharma company and the CRO at the trial level to ensure that the daily work of the trial is happening on a continuous basis as per the plan. So the governance is an absolutely clear, mandatory environmental factor. It's almost like the hygiene factor you have to build, overriding at the top of the tree for the trial co. Ben?
I don't have anything to add to that, but I fully agree.
yeah, and Birgitte, do you agree as well, or do you think it's more complicated than that? It sounds easy.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think you need to create a macro before you go into the details on the micro pieces. And again, I mean, you need to. I think it's worthwhile pursuing such a conceptual idea, at least need to try it out. And then when you face some of the challenges, I mean, you just need to address them. And the more you can proactively address them, the better. But I mean, it is complex. I mean, it's not getting less complex to do drug development because you take it out of a company's portfolio and set it into a new structure. I mean, the same challenges will exist. But again, I mean, there are ways around it. And again, I think it would be great if it could be tried out.
So the homework that Ben described is an important part. Because,
it is, yeah.
As always.
As always.
So would you say that a partnership model like this would be a significant advantage for certain types of patient populations?
So I might be biased in my perspective now because I have worked several years in areas of rare diseases. And as I said before, I have encountered several programs that had the opportunity to be realized, but where we couldn't invest in them to progress them. So I think in the rare diseases space, there are plenty of opportunities. I mean, we have several biologics, including at GSK in the asthma space, severe eosinophilic asthma, Nucala, and interleukin-5 monoclonal antibody that is being developed also for severe eosinophilic rare disease. I think you have the same in Novartis, interleukin-1 being developed originally for rheumatoid arthritis, but with the emerging science and insight into the genetics of rare diseases and upregulation of protein, I mean, there were several, rare disease indications that could be addressed, but many more than actually could be brought forward to a licensed indication. And at many times, licensed indication is required in order to receive access and reimbursement. But there are also many, innovative, novel molecules where they can't be progressed. So I think in the rare disease space, there are several opportunities, but also in the niche medicine area, because there are many, parallel indications where either a large indication is being pursued as the first indication and several follow-ons where you can't accommodate them all into your investment, whereas at other times it might be a small indication that goes first with others to come along. Yep. So I see opportunities also in that area. So like niche medicines, like rare diseases, and then repurposed medicines as well.
And some of these could also be maybe easier to attract philanthropic or patient group financing in trial companies like this, or trial costs, which is great.
I think it's a great example with the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. I mean, at many times, rare diseases, stakeholders, patients, parents are the ones who actually start fundraising and even starting their own companies. And there are examples of private-public industry collaborations also in the rare diseases space where that has been a means in order to try to unfold a potential medicine for some patients that otherwise wouldn't have been addressed or possible to be addressed.
Good. You also serve as a board member in several smaller biotechs, and in the description of this session we raised the question on whether the excess of promising assets with large biopharma would affect in a negatively way other parts of the life sciences ecosystem. And what is your view on that? Is that risk at all there? Or?
So I think that large pharma is only one part of the equation. And the ecosystem is a dynamic, rapidly evolving field. Partly influenced by the external environment, but many parties contribute to that ecosystem. So in that evolution, now already, several, new business models is being pursued. At GSK and I'm sure many other companies also, the academic industry collaboration is an established business model in order to identify opportunities as well as progress them from discovery research into target validation or even into a proof of principle or proof of concept or even further on in a clinical stage development. So I think the industry academic collaboration is an established model. The private-public industry collaboration is another established way of working. So I think a new model like this is just part of the evolution, how things emerges in my mind, because there is a need to create new structures, new vehicles that can potentially unfold some of the promise that these assets or programs holds. So I don't see that there's one negative part. I think we all shape the field, we all contribute to advance how we realize opportunities in our emerging reality.
Yeah. That is also how I interpreted you, Jakob. You said, I mean, there are both types of investments, and you don't see that this will drive investments going to only these kinds of assets or trial codes. There will be both ways. Yeah,
I think
so. So we should see it as a risk. It's an opportunity, which is good. Ole, being from a bank, you represent an institutional investor into this sector. And which assets would you say are most suitable for this type of setup?
So it's this is really about trials, not really assets. So trials linked to assets, and I think you can always debate what assets or trials are ideal for this setup. But I think one sort of area is obviously, you can say, earlier stage projects, which are not really in focus of the biopharma for various reasons. It could be that the company needs to focus on other areas. It lacks the financial resources to really pursue certain projects. So I think one group is sort of early stage projects where the company cannot really focus.
Do you agree on that, Joe?
Yes, it depends what you call early stage. For me, I think phase 1 assets are probably not a great place to go. You know, if you're doing a PKPD or some sort of the real analytical work, you're going to be doing it in a clinic, a specialized pharmaceutical, phase 1 unit. So for me, the perfect asset is one which has either got great data in phase 1, but has fallen down on the tree because the overall MPV of the asset is low, or even better, a trial which has got some hint of promise in a phase 2A, but not quite enough to jump up to the next phase 2B, where the trial cost goes from maybe 3 million up to $14-15 million. And at that point, that would, to me, would be the sweetest spot to try and use this mechanism to fund the trials. And therefore, through that, you're getting a decent risk of development, and also the I would say the rate of increase of value of the asset is probably at its maximum, in my view.
Do you agree on that, Birgitte? Is that the sweet spot?
So I think, again, the sweet spot in my mind is asset dependent, because each clinical trial will hold its specific opportunities and challenges. So I think it's really on an asset by asset basis related to the clinical trial. I think you can't decouple the two. The indication definitely also applies. So I think, but yeah, I think the early to mid stage one, again, dependent on which is indication. Sometimes you go straight into patients and have an abbreviated development program and development path. So I think, again, I would say it's on a case-to-case basis.
So it's tedious homework. We come back to that for each opportunity to really dig down into the details. Yeah. The devil is in the details, and probably
always
here as well,
details.
right? But all that, back to you. What type of investors would you say primarily would be interested in this type of trial close?
Let's say it is trials in the earlier phase. I would say that these setups would probably be more suited for certain venture capital funds, and maybe less suited for the so-called typical institutional investors that we see are investing in sort of IPOs. And I'm sure Jakob can comment on it as well, being a fund.
Yeah, I think it's all about assessing risk here and probabilities, and then you really need to have the expertise or get the expertise to do that evaluation in order to take that to your negotiation with the biopharma, which is a delicate topic, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't you think all of that you said of course where the asset is, but are there other reasons for why the institutional investors may not be the ideal partners here?
I think one thing is, of course, that they are not really able to probably do the required due diligence and spend that amount of time that is needed to really understand the setup. And if it would be, you can say, a trial co with a higher risk profile, it is probably not ideal for many of the institutions that we are talking to, because these institutions are looking for, call it, assets or companies with lower risk profiles. That means companies that have projects in quite late stages of the development cycle, or projects that are in a very early stage but are very promising, for example, due to an out-licensing agreement with a big pharma.
From your perspective, institutional investor perspective, do you see any challenges with the idea of creating these trial codes overall? I mean, apart from what we have been discussing in terms of the trials as such.
Of course, I mean, there are different stakeholders coming together, and of course you need to pre-agree on this setup when you establish the trial co, but I'm sure there would be some difficulties and tough discussions when it comes to ownership agenda. What about the sort of exit horizon? I think that could be one interesting topic. And I think the valuation topic will be very interesting. What is each party providing into this trial co? So I think those are a couple of the sort of areas that could be challenging when creating or trying to create these structures.
I'll come back to that a little bit, but are there also potential synergies?
I think many of the synergies have been mentioned here earlier today. I mean, it's very obvious that it drives business for the CROs. The investors are provided with potential upside. And the companies that are providing these projects into the trial codes, they are able to, you can say, have a more focused strategy and spend their financial resources in a more efficient way. So I think those are the win-win-win that we was
So you
mentioned
confirm
earlier.
that also from your perspective. Jacob, having different ownership agendas and in terms of holding in periods and exits, that is not unique to this type of investment, I would say, or partnership, but quite common also among different VC investors in a standalone company. So would you say that this suggested trial co-model would suffer more from such diverging agendas, and if so, why?
Well, I guess it's basically one owner, right? Because it would need to be totally independent of the biopharma from an ownership perspective, if I'm not mistaken, right? But then it all comes back to the buyback rights and obligations. And of course, that can be a very complex discussion. You, of course, will have different views on valuation. Should I get 3 or 5 times or 7 times the money if it's a successful trial? And are there any ways out for the biopharma in the buyback situation? And what happens then? Is this asset at all tradable on an isolated basis? Should the biopharma default or pull back, being in breach of contract? What do I know? I think
so
you have to
this
think about those scenarios, unfortunately, too, right?
Might be quite tricky negotiations. So, Jo, could you comment on that? What is your view? How do you ensure that you don't need to spend years in negotiations before you can create this trial co?
Firstly, I fully agree. It's got to be totally independent. There is no way that one party of the 3 parties can control the trial co. For me, every single trial which goes in has to be the priority at that time for the 3 partners who are joining forces. Trial co is an entity. It doesn't even exist. It's a virtual entity which really is there to facilitate the negotiation and to facilitate the operationalization as well as the funding part. So for me, I fully agree that the discussions at the beginning would need a very clear and open framework, a rigid set of valuation criteria, which are understood by all parties. And of course, the debate will start. For me, it would be largely the CRO to tell you, the pharma company or academic institution, whatever, to actually say what the design of the trial needs to be in order to realize the pathway of the CDP. At that point, the CRO will be able to tell you an acute valuation and timeline for the trial delivery and the data delivery, because at the end of the day, the trial is worthless until you have the CSR in your hands. Until you have the data, you can't make any decisions. And then the financial company with the pharma company would then need to debate the relative merits of the valuations which are being brought to the table. So it really is going to be different people will have different steps to play in order to get the full agreement from a financial point of view.
Ole and Jakob, what do you say? Do you think this sort of solves, or at least is an idea how to take it further?
Well, I think you need to agree up front what will happen, and it will be sort of a binary outcome at the end. Although everything is not binary, of course, in this world, but it needs to be. It needs to be clear. We have, funded many companies with tranched investments, milestone-driven, and when you come to the milestone, not seldom, it's difficult to, translate those milestones into the real events that happened, because it's quite often that things don't go exactly as planned.
It's very clear rules from the beginning.
Yeah, so you need clear rules from the outset. Otherwise, you cannot, evaluate the risk return profile of the investment.
Okay, good.
I can only agree to that. I think it's since there are some complications around the setup, it has to be very transparent and clear from the beginning.
Yeah.
Birgitte, we have mentioned several times here today the CRO and the CRO's role, and you're a board member of a CRO. What benefits would you see for a CRO to engage in a partnership like this? I mean, we have said, okay, they will have a flow of income, but are there other benefits?
So I can see, opportunities for a CRO to expand their offerings, expanding their focus area, creating new business opportunities, new return of investment, new growth. So definitely, I think the CROs again is undergoing a lot of change in terms of what they need to deliver and where they can play their particular offerings. But definitely, I think, given that this is a core component of this new proposed business structure, business model, I think for those suited and for those wanting to create a new business space, wanting to create or explore a new opportunity, I definitely think there is a space, an opportunity, an upside for those who would have an appetite or need to expand some of their.
Yeah, some of them have a need, but is there also risk of lack of capability?
So I think, it definitely would be a new role for CRO to engage in such a structure, and therefore I think it would require some capability building. Establishing that kind of capability that would go into that tri-party structure in a new way, having another stake in how you develop the programs, even though I still think the intent is that it would be with a speciality discipline of a CRO in executing the trial. But again, a CRO comes in different forms also. They can be purely operational execution. They can also provide regulatory and medical strategic direction, etc. So again, I think it varies. But capability building, I think, would be required. I think for any company, including CROs, there's a risk if you go too wide. You might lose focus, and hence you might lose your specific how you distinguish yourself and profile yourself versus the competition. So I think there's always a risk of getting too defocused if you take on such a new investment, because it is building up new capabilities, and hence you need to have a desire and a good case, I think, for the first intent with some kind of risk sharing in the investment to engage on that. So yeah, I think there are upsides, but there are also, of course, potential risks that at least needs to be addressed in the context of where in a life cycle a company, CRO company is, and where they are designed to play.
And what about competence? Do we have sufficient amount of competence to take care of all these trials that now will come out in these and other models?
So I think, I mean, the CRO industry is very broad and is, again, both very general as well as emerging into very specialized niche companies, niche offerings. So yes, I think depending on what would be the first cohort of trials you would take into such an exploratory model, I think you would have that company that would fit those required capabilities. I think that could go in there.
Good.
I have a feeling about this and that's only based on my own experience, but I think that it will probably, in order to make this become a reality or more common, I think it will probably be a good way to go if the biopharma would sort of package this in a turnkey solution type of, at least from the start, so that the other stakeholders can evaluate something very concrete and straightforward. I've been in a few situations where there has been 6 months or 12 months of discussions about what trial design are we going for, and the lead times are really long, and I respect that, there are many layers and people who needs to say what they think about it, but then it becomes, the sort of prioritized because you lose the pace. But if you have it up front, packaged neatly, then I think you may have a swift process and come to an arrangement.
Yeah,
Would you
pace
agree?
is important.
I fully agree.
Yeah.
We all know that the setup time of a clinical trial
Yeah.
is months and months and months. And depending where you go, you're adding more or less months. So, for me, if this is going to work, you really need to be from the moment an organization thinks it has a trial which is suitable, which it cannot develop on its own, to the moment the trial starts, really has to be less than a year.
Yeah.
And that is including almost 9 months of the setup time, the protocol teasing out in order for this to be truly valuable to organizations. Money is time is access to patients, and quite frankly, some patients don't have the access to time. So speed is of the essence, and having a very clear framework about how something goes in and the mechanism between all the parties is absolutely mandatory.
And I think in order to achieve that, you really need to carefully evaluate which trial, which program, which indication, because it's not in control of these 3 components alone. I mean, the regulatory agencies plays a huge role in the protocol design, which are the agreed endpoints, which is required bioassays that's required in order to demonstrate your evidence of efficacy and safety. So I think, again, back to the individual evaluation of the program, this trial, the asset, etc.
And I think there's another business dynamic to it as well. If you want to have some sort of a competition with your asset or your program, you need to, be really clear what they are competing about. Otherwise, you will have 5 parallel discussions on different clinical design programs, consuming man years.
Yeah, which is not at least what we want to do, as time is really an important parameter. That is why we're trying to do this. Otherwise, patent expiration is coming even closer. So then it's worthless. Okay, so just a few minutes left. So each of you, if you were approached by a biopharma company offering you to participate in this kind of partnership model around one or more complementary assets or trials, would you be willing to engage in evaluating the opportunity, and what would be your first control question? Just yes or no, and which control question? Birgitte?
You need to start there. I need to think a little more.
I suppose so.
So I have an open mind to explore new opportunities. And of course, I would need to be backed by the larger company I'm working at, because I will not control that single decision on my own. But yes, I would be open to explore and engage in the discussions. So the key question, I mean, for my part would be, which is the program? Why do we believe that this program holds value within that time frame where it still will have patent expiry, and it doesn't jeopardize value of potential other programs that would be on the same asset? So really, I would evaluate. The key question would be, pick that asset that could fulfill certain criteria that should be eligible for that model.
Good, thank you. Ole?
Yeah, I think definitely, an interesting opportunity. So I would explore it. It would be interesting to know what is the driving force behind the biopharma wanting to do this. I would really want to understand 100% why is this attractive for the biopharma to do this for this specific project. Then I think it's very important to have the full and the best setup with the 3 different parties. It has to be the right CRO, it has to be the right type of investors, and it has to be the right biopharma and the right project. So that's of course complicated, but if you can find that setup, then I think it could be very compelling. And then you have all the challenges around valuation and exit horizon and so on. But it's definitely worth a try.
Good. So this was your first control question. What about you, Jacob?
Well, yeah, I guess I would have asked, would you have run the program yourselves had you had the financial resources? Would be my control question.
That's a good one.
Myself, I would actually ask pretty much the same question. Why are we in this situation to actually look at an alternative from the traditional way of that we, as a biopharma, would be working? And the immediate follow-up question is, if I do this, how can I be sure of the quality? Because at the end of the day, if the data generated isn't demonstrating of good quality, we have absolutely nothing. And all parties have failed in their task. So quality for me is a real core element.
Good. So thank you very much. And this has been an hour and 15 minutes, triggering your minds on a new model of financing low priority clinical trials. It hasn't been tested, but it appears that the people here at least are convinced that it's worthwhile trying. And there are lots of pros. There are some challenges, as always. I hope you have all had an enjoyable 75 minutes. And thank you very much for being with us here this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.